The Gillard government established the Clean Energy Regulator in 2012 to help facilitate a carbon trading scheme, which has had some success overseas in pushing big polluters to curb their emissions. It's the regulator's job to issue carbon credits to farmers and businesses who are legitimately either capturing and storing carbon emissions or participating in abatement by agreeing not to deforest, for example. Once those businesses have the carbon credits, they can sell them to large polluters. A carbon credit represents 1 tonne of emissions. Big emitters want carbon credits because the credits, on paper, offset their emissions. The whole idea of the carbon credit scheme is that as the price of these carbon credits rises, big polluters move to invest in renewable energy projects instead, helping to reduce their emissions, to avoid having to buy the higher priced credits in the first place. But what if the carbon credits aren't backed by, well, anything? Andrew McIntosh chaired the Emissions Reductions Assurance Committee 7 years ago. It's a statutory body responsible for the integrity of the carbon offset scheme. He's now spoken out, saying too many carbon credits are issued for bogus reasons.
And what we've got happening at the moment is a collection of things across a range of methods, and they include things like, as you said, issuing credits to not clear forests that were never going to be cleared, to issue credits for growing trees that simply aren't there, or issuing credits for growing trees that are already there.
The Clean Energy Regulator rejects the claims.
So the market is there and it's working. And the Australian carbon credit market is very highly regarded internationally.
The man ultimately responsible for the carbon credit scheme, Energy Minister Angus Taylor, says the regulator's been enormously successful fulfilling its role.
Look at the outcomes. 100 million tonnes of abatement delivered, over 200 million contracted, 17 million in the last year alone. Well-regarded credits that are well priced in the market, significantly higher than credits in other countries. These are the outcomes that matter.
All right, let's try and unpack this a bit now. Polly Hemming is an advisor in the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy team, and she joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Now, let's just start at the beginning. Can you remind us what carbon credits are and how the trading scheme works?
Sure. I think David did a pretty good job, but carbon credits are generated by landholders and businesses who carry out various activities across the economy that reduce, store or avoid emissions. And in exchange for carrying out those activities, they have to be carried out according to certain rules set by the Clean Energy Regulator. But in exchange for every tonne of CO2 or CO2 equivalent that a project stores or reduces, they're issued with a carbon credit. And they can sell these carbon credits back to the government, who uses the funds from the Emissions Reduction Fund, or else they can sell them on this secondary voluntary market to big emitters who are looking to offset their pollution. So currently the government is the biggest buyer of carbon credits in Australia. The voluntary market, or the market that we refer to, is actually very small. So supply to that market has been very tight. Government is the biggest buyer of abatement. And there's a couple of things that are really important about the way these credits are generated. They have to be real, i.e. the activities that they're doing actually have to result in abatement, but they also have to be additional. And what that means is that the whole point of the ERF, the Emissions Reduction Fund, is to incentivise abatement that wasn't going to happen anyway. So it has to be done on top of business as usual.
Now, isn't the goal that these credits are traded more often and their price goes up, and that means that that people will eventually say, actually, I might as well just reduce emissions. Might be more cost effective that way.
You've nailed it. That's exactly what you would want out of a carbon price or a carbon credit price. The price should be prohibitive enough that it's actually cheaper for you to reduce your emissions or change your business model, so you have those reductions before you kind of get to the point of having to offset. So offsets really only have a very narrow application. They should only be used for those genuinely hard to abate industries such as agriculture or steel. So you want the price to be high enough that there's no incentive to say, well, we don't need to change our business model. We can just offset as a first port of call. So ideally, that's what you want. Unfortunately, in Australia, that's not necessarily what's happening. We did have a fairly high price on our carbon credits. They were up about $50. The price has recently dropped significantly after some government announcements. And what that has meant is that it looks like carbon credits will actually be more affordable to, say, those big emitters who don't actually want to change their business model, such as gas companies, and it's just easier for them to offset instead. And as Professor McIntosh alluded to, there's already huge integrity issues with carbon credits. So not only are they not resulting in real and additional abatement, but they're being used by big emitters or polluting industries to theoretically offset pollution, but that's not actually happening. It might be on paper, but nothing is actually being offset.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of those allegations that you've just mentioned, that, you know, the credits gained on projects that actually have no chance of properly abating climate change. Who's overseeing this process?
Professor McIntosh came out and he mentioned those, you know, 3 biggest methods that are generating carbon credits that are allegedly not real and not additional. But I also just want to add that these are concerns that have been raised over a number of years. The Australia Institute had a report raising these concerns, but it's also been, you know, widely raised by other academics and independent parties that have largely been ignored by the government body regulating this scheme, which is the Clean Energy Regulator. It's an independent government body that, as you say, regulates the entire emissions reduction fund. It designs carbon credit methods, it regulates carbon credit methods, but somewhat problematically, it's also tasked with buying carbon credits on behalf of the government at lowest cost. So the fact that you've got a government body carrying out all those functions is a problem in and of itself. But then you've got this regulator who's been mandated to buy credits as cheaply as possible. And it's not clear, I don't think, to anyone outside of this system what the safeguards are that would ensure integrity in the system. You know, if you're being told that you need to buy carbon credits as cheap as possible, where are the safeguards that are actually ensuring integrity and making sure that the regulator or projects aren't cutting corners to try and keep the price as low as possible?
Mark Kenny, can I bring you here? There's a range of reasons I'm really glad that Polly's here, and one of them is this is so complicated, right? And is that kind of part of the problem with scrutiny and broader public understanding of the system, of what's going on?
I think it's very much part of the problem, Julia. It's been explained very well, but I still think you could probably, if you had time, go and talk to 1,000 people at random around any city and ask them about the carbon credit scheme, and you would be very lucky if you found someone who actually gave you anything approaching an explanation of it. And I probably wouldn't be one of them either, frankly. And I've seen the emissions trading scheme issue come and go. I've seen the carbon price come and go. I've seen the theatrical high octane politics of this issue for a long time, but it's always been quite complicated. And I think that actually has been a problem. What we see today, though, I think in the criticisms from Andrew McIntosh and others, and from the Australia Institute, is the problem of opaqueness, even for those people who are looking at it quite closely and who do understand these complex mechanisms, do understand how it's meant to work. But it's even been admitted by the regulator today that there are limits on the level of explicitness, if I can put it like that, that they have in terms of showing where these carbon reduction sites are, where these carbon abatement projects exist exactly, so that for the purposes of understanding and getting value for money. And the other thing to say about this is, if we think about it in the architecture, the sort of political opera that we've had right through the more than a decade now on this issue. The Emissions Reduction Fund, which is at the heart of this, came about because the Liberal Party and the Nationals were implacably opposed to emissions trading, notwithstanding John Howard's original position on it prior to 2007. It became an article of faith to oppose it. And we have this bizarre situation where we went from a market-based system where the market would set the price and the mechanism would drive down carbon emissions overall, because it would be in the interests of polluters to do that, to a system now where we have the government being the largest purchaser of these permits. And whose money do you think they're using to buy those permits? It's taxpayer funds.
Yeah. Now, Craig, you were in the government that set up the Clean Energy Regulator. What has gone wrong?
Yep. Well, the evidence that has been brought forward should go, and I assume today did go, to the Clean Energy Regulator, because it's in the interest of everyone to have the highest integrity associated with these carbon credit units. My understanding is it hasn't previously gone to the Clean Energy Regulator, so they're in a position where they have to look at this evidence now.
Can I
the
just
idea of
sorry, Craig, if I can just bring, Polly has just been saying that these concerns have been raised over a period of years. Is that right?
They've been raised over a period of years.
Yes,
a number of years.
Hold on, but this, I know that, but this evidence has not, right? This evidence has been brought forward now. I'm just saying in a very constructive way. I would suggest that Andrew McIntosh engages with the Clean Energy Regulator on this. For this reason, the idea of carbon credits is a good idea, and it was. The irony is the coalition government said we can't have a price on carbon. There is actually a price on carbon, Australian carbon credit units, and as has been said, they're about $35. They reached almost $50. And only a couple of years ago, they were $14. And that's $14 for 1 tonne of carbon that is avoided, if you like, through such activities as revegetating areas and not clearing them. Now, I think it's a great thing that if we have a system that actually encourages revegetation, in particular, revegetation to restore biological diversity and protect and save endangered species, we should be all in favour of that, not saying this is a terrible thing, it should be pulled apart. Not that anyone is actually saying that, including Andrew McIntosh.
Right. Isn't that more a question of that's the goal, but it's not happening?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So it's in the interests of everyone to have the highest integrity, because then you get the highest prices, and farmers can actually allow their land to revegetate. You can get a premium where it restores biological diversity. And in Northern Australia, from these carbon credit units, there are First Nations Indigenous groups who are doing savanna burning early in the season. And that sort of sounds, well, why would you burn the savanna? The answer is late in the season it burns anyway because of lightning strikes. So if you burn early, you avoid a lot of carbon going into the atmosphere. I can see, and I like the idea of a future where we have more biological diversity, less land clearing, and reductions in carbon emissions. So to me, it's a good concept. Of course, if there's integrity issues, if people have got evidence, bring it forward. But let's not get rid of the whole
system. All right, well, let me get Polly's view on that. Do you share Craig's optimism that the regulator might look at this and say, oh, this is new evidence, I wasn't aware this was occurring before?
I would strenuously object to the idea that the regulator hasn't been made aware of this earlier. Professor McIntosh himself raised these issues by his own admission when he was chair of the Emissions Reduction Fund. Emissions Reduction Assurance Committee.
Not this evidence.
Well, okay.
We're talking about evidence that was tabled yesterday.
I'll just answer the question.
You strenuously objected to it, and now you want to set it aside.
No, let's just let Polly finish. Yes.
Well, I just think there's no point in debating it on air. Anyway, I don't think anyone is suggesting tearing this apart, and I think everyone agrees that in principle, the Emissions Reduction Fund has a really important role to play in climate policy. You know, both major parties are suggesting that offsets, carbon credits, will play a part in their net zero roles. This is a central part of either party's climate policy. What we're saying, and what others are saying, and what the Australia Institute is calling for, is restoring integrity to this system, ensuring that the emissions reductions are real and additional. No one is disputing that it's great for farmers and that it is fantastic for, you know, Indigenous livelihoods with savanna burning projects. But the whole premise of the Emissions Reduction Fund is to reduce emissions. Okay. In its current context, it is not doing that. The credits currently don't have integrity, and the Emissions Reduction Fund is basically being used as a license to pollute. The supply of credits that is coming out is so dramatic that the price has dropped. It's making it easier for these big emitters that are part of the industries, part of the government's